it works.
I always forget that my voice is not audible to anybody. There's times in the week when I have no voice, so I'm glad the Lord gives me voice for Sunday morning, even if I do need amplification. So we're going to read from chapter 18, verse 19 through chapter 19, verse 16. And what this is the trials of Jesus. First, the trials before the Jewish authorities, and then the trial before Pilate. There's actually two trials before the Jewish people. One before Annas, who was high priest the year before, and one by Caiaphas, who was high priest in his current year, and then the trial before Pilate. And in all of them, you can see that the whole thing is fixed, and they're going through the motions to try and make it all nice and legal. But they already have their minds made up what the end result will be. And so as we read, we'll try to pick that up. I'd like for you to watch as we read this and see what emotions it raises up in you, or what responses as you read. What's the flavor of this text? And I hope that will, when we get to the end, we'll pause and reflect on that. So Psalm chapter 18, beginning in verse 19, and I guess, Dave, we'll start with you this morning.
Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. "I have spoken only to the world," Jesus replied. "I always taught in synagogues or at the temple, where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said." When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby struck him in the face. "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" he demanded. "If I said something wrong," Jesus replied, "testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me?" Then Ananias sent him, still bound, to Cephas, the high priest.
As Simon Peter stood warming himself, he was asked, "Are you not one of you are not one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. "Didn't I see you with him in the olive grove?" Again Peter denied it, and at that moment a rooster began to crow.
Then the Jews led Jesus. From Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, the Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you."
Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," the Jews objected. This happened so that the words Jesus had spoken, indicating the kind of death he was going to die, would be fulfilled. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?"
Is that your own idea? Jesus asked. Or did others talk to you about me? Am I a Jew? Pilate replied. It was your people and your chief priests who handed you over to me. What is it you have done? Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews. But now my kingdom is from another place."
You are a king then, said Pilate. Jesus answered, You are right in saying I am a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. What is true? Pilate asked. With this, he went out again to the Jews and said, I find no basis for a charge against him. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews? They shout back, No, not him. Give us Barabbas. Now Barabbas had taken part in a rebellion.
Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. He clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, Hail, King of the Jews! And they struck him in the face. Once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews, Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him. When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, Here is the man. As soon as the chief priests and the officials saw him, they shouted, Crucify, crucify. But Pilate answered, You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him.
The Jews insisted he of the law, and according to the law, he must die and put the name of the synagogue. When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. Where do you come from? He asked Jesus. But Jesus gave no answer. You refuse to speak to me, Pilate said. Don't you realize I have power? I am free to crucify him? Jesus answered, You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of whoever it is.
From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jews kept shouting, If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be the king opposes Caesar. When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at the place known as Stone of Onions, with his habit. It was the day of preparation of the Passover week, about the 6th hour. Here is your king, Pilate said to the Jews.
And they therefore cried out, Away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, Shall I crucify your king? Chief priests answered, We have no king but Caesar. So he then delivered him to them to be crucified.
Let's pray once more. Father, we're reading very interesting events in the life, at the end of the life of Jesus. And we see, Heavenly Father, how earthly ways and God's way diverge. And we realize, Heavenly Father, it's still possible for that to happen today. But help us, Heavenly Father, to open our eyes and our ears and our hearts to this passage and to begin to realize what Jesus went through on our behalf. The Son of God, God Himself, on trial. And on trial for what is right and what is true. And He was the one, the standard of truth. So, Father, we pray that you will help us to learn from Him and to honor Him by the way we live. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, who's prepared to comment on what they saw and felt during this reading?
It's very plain Pilate wanted no part of this, I don't think.
Okay.
He was, it was landed in his lap, but he kept saying, you've got an opportunity to take him back. You know, I don't have to do anything to him. I don't see any reason for doing anything to him. and the Jewish people kept pushing for it.
Okay. Yeah, for sure. 3 times Pilate says, I find no guilt in him. What's he doing here? And eventually even he scourged him. Where does it say that? It's someplace in that reading. That was their lie detector machine back in those days, was you beat them until they spoke up and told the truth. And of course, Jesus had nothing to confess. So the scourging, which was a Roman scourging, had no limit. And he must have been beaten practically to death. But you're right, Pilate wanted to, right from the beginning, wash his hands and say, what's this got to do with me? Why did it have something to do with him, according to the Jews?
He was the representative of Caesar, of the power of the Roman Empire.
Okay.
And so instead of, I guess what I found interesting was instead of relying on the power of their own, like the authority that comes from God or the authority that came from their own chief priest or anything like that, they turned to the power of the state at that time to
Okay.
punish him for religious reasons. Which
Okay.
is what I found interesting.
Very good, but why did they want to shift it to Pilate?
Because according to their laws, they couldn't execute him, but
Okay.
Roman laws, he could be executed.
Right. The Roman law, in fact, you could not execute a person on the judgment of the Jewish council. It was against the Roman law. So they want to shift it to Pilate because what have they got in mind?
They want to execute.
Yeah, we want to kill him and we can't do that, so that's why we're here. But notice how they lie. The reason we brought him to you is because he's evil. We wouldn't have brought him here. What do you think, Pilate? Why are you asking me what's the problem? If there wasn't a problem, we wouldn't have brought him here. And,
But they didn't really give a reason, did they?
They never did.
Yeah.
No, they never did, because there was no good reason. Okay, any other comments on the overall thrust of this passage?
I know that there are other passages that said that Pilate's wife warned him against it. They said, don't do nothing with that, he just said that.
Mm-hmm.
So in his household, there must have been discussion about him. It's not written here. That is why Pilate did not want to do anything with him. He was warned by his wife and said, listen, he's a prophet. Leave it, he's an innocent man, leave him alone.
Mhm, yeah, that's detailed from one of the other gospel accounts.
Wives are always putting in these wise comments.
Yeah.
It's stated from way back here.
Great one, honey.
His wife had a bad dream, and she rushed out and said, Pilate, don't mess with this guy. And that was probably God at work in her life, who knows? But he was warned more than once. What else? Anything else?
Well, nobody really wants to be responsible for killing an innocent man.
Okay.
So dodging the bullet or both ways, they both, we don't know what we can do. We don't want to be responsible, but we want to put it on the other guy, and the other guy wants to put it back on you, and it's a kind of a wishy-washy thing. Something has to be done.
Yeah, in one of the other Gospels, it actually says that Pilate got some water out and washed his hands and said, his blood be on you and your people. They said, fine. What in the world would you say? Would you ask that for you and your descendants, blood would be on you? And man, oh man, has history ever proved them right? What was it in World War II? 6 million Jews were killed. And it's just down through the years. They have borne the brunt of the anger of people who don't believe in God. But they ask for it. So all this, I think, it seems to me there's one more thing that hasn't been mentioned yet, and that is the fact that it's obvious that this is a put-up job. As you read through, you see Jesus. In fact, you got to ask yourself, who was in control here? The Jewish crowds, the Roman governor, or Jesus? And Jesus knew what the outcome had to be to fulfill prophecy, to make salvation available to us. And so there's times when he doesn't even answer, and Pilate says, don't you know that I've got authority to turn you loose? Oh yeah, Pilate. So why don't you use it? He didn't use it because he was afraid. And someplace here it says, in verse 8 of chapter 19, Pilate heard this statement that he made himself the Son of God, and he was even more afraid. Not he was afraid, but he was even more afraid from the beginning. Pilate did not want to be involved in this situation, and he was afraid of the people. He was afraid of the mob. He was afraid of what it might happen to him. And incidentally, Pilate's procuratorship only lasted a couple of years after this event, and he was as much as exiled. His political career went down the drain, and he may as well have gone ahead and done the right thing, because he didn't save anything. So the first place they take Jesus is to Annas. I don't know if you know this, probably you do, but the high priesthood was for sale. The Roman government decided who was going to be high priest, and it had shrunk down to not the lifetime of the high priest, but to 1 year. Oh, on the way down here, I said to myself, I gotta remember to check if that alarm is turned off.
Did you take your pills?
Yeah, notice it's not for pills, but I did take them, and I can't find where in the world I put that thing. I put it in the wrong bag. It's been a bad week in that kind of way. My brain has only worked half time. Okay, can you hear me now? So, where were we? Oh, the high priest. So, whoever paid the most to the Roman government got to be high priest. And Annas had been the high priest last year, but Caiaphas was this year. But obviously the people still recognized Annas, and they take him to him first. But of course there's no official status for him anymore, not legally. And so then they take him over to Caiaphas, and it doesn't tell us what happened at his place, but it's not very long. In fact, early in the morning, they take him over to Pilate. Now, that indicates probably, they'll show you a place if you tour over there where Jesus was locked up overnight. But I think the text seems to indicate that he wasn't locked up. They gave him a hard time all night. And early in the morning. Now the thing was, the Sanhedrin was not supposed to meet after dark or before light. And so this whole trial was a setup. And they were going against their own rules to try Jesus in the nighttime. But of course, as we know in the Gospel of John, there's sort of this play between dark and light. And they are bringing out the dark side of them. And so they do it at night. And of course, the whole idea was to get it over with before too many people found out what was going on. Their excuse was that it was the day of preparation for the Passover. And so they need to get Jesus on the cross and off the cross before they celebrated the feast. And it became apparent what was going on.
Was Caiaphas the person that met with Jesus? Remember when Jesus was talking about he must be born again? And he was asked, how can you be born again? Was that Caiaphas?
I think that was Nicodemus.
Nicodemus.
I think. But we did bump into Caiaphas before when, and I forget which chapter, even here in John it's recorded, and Caiaphas said, it makes sense that one man should die for the nation instead of the whole nation being destroyed. And it was an example of catastrophic thinking. Some people who make a catastrophe out of everything. And that's the way this was. They said, what'll happen if we let this guy go on is that Rome will come and they will take away our place and they'll punish us and they'll destroy us. They just made a catastrophe out of the whole thing. And that's when Caiaphas said, hey, we need to recognize that it's better for one man to die for the nation. And actually he was speaking the truth. Because of course Jesus not only died for that nation, but for our nation and for us. And for what we needed when we came along on the scene 20 centuries later.
Same goes with Pilate here too, because wasn't he afraid that the Jews were going to have a riot at that particular time, at this particular time, and therefore that's why he unwashed his hands of the whole matter and gave them to the Jews to do what they want.
Yeah, the Romans were supposedly in control, but when the Jews got together, it was often a riot. There was often people rising up against Rome, or rising up in some other way that wouldn't be bad enough that they would get punished by Rome. But you're exactly right. This whole thing was totally unrealistic, and unfortunately, it continued. Why did Jesus end up on the cross? If he said that he wasn't guilty, the thief on the cross, one of them said, you know, we're here because we deserve it, but he's done nothing wrong. His disciples were there, and they knew he'd done nothing wrong. And in spite of the fact that he was totally innocent, he got the death penalty. And it bothers me because I know what I'm capable of. I know that it's easy. You know, these people who cry, crucify him, some of them were there a week ago when he rode in and they're calling, hallelujah. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. One short week ago. And yet, today, they're shifted off in another direction and they're saying, we want him crucified. No matter what you want to say, crucify him.
That's the power of a crowd.
Yeah.
I have to say this, brother. The death of Jesus was something so beautiful. It is something so beautiful. But because we are human, we tend to think that its death was something bad. But when we look at from in Genesis and what sin and Satan has done, is that was something beautiful in reconciling the world back to God and bringing back everything under the kingship of God. It only could be done by the death of Jesus. So what I try to do when I look at it is to take out the physical aspect, the physical part of what he went through, even though that was painful, but that was a beautiful thing from a spiritual standpoint in bringing back me so I could have access to God. So while this evil thing was done to him, physically, it was a beautiful thing in reconciling the world to God.
The only way I would differ with you is to say the result of it was a beautiful thing. Absolutely. Without it, we'd be hopeless. Can you imagine us having no hope in this world? And lots of people don't. The pandemic has made that abundantly clear. All kinds of people are trying to get in line for counseling services. I happen to know personally.
Yeah.
Because of the pandemic. But we have a hope that is sure and steadfast, and it's because Jesus died and made way for us. As you go through here, what do you think up to this point is the worst thing that happens to Jesus? The crucifixion, obviously, we'll get to that next week, but in this section where Jesus is put on trial, what do you think is the worst outcome of this part of the text?
That so many people changed their minds and turned against him
Okay,
just because of popular influence.
okay,
That had to be extremely disheartening. They're the people he's dying for,
mm-hmm.
and they turned it back.
Good comment.
Peter's denial, 3 times.
Okay,
He said, oh no, I won't do that. And he did.
within hours, not even days. Yeah, interesting. And it sort of reminds me that on one level, we have a commitment to Jesus to stand with him, and like Peter said, even to die for him. But then over here on this side, there's me. And what I'll do, in spite of the fact that I claim this over here, and it's not only that crowd, it still happens today. And from time to time, it happens in my life. I remember, maybe I told you this story before, but back when I used to travel quite a bit, I used to go to the Abilene Christian College lectures each year because my supporting church was in Texas. And I always picked the cheapest way to get there. And so I flew from wherever I was to Dallas, and then got to the bus station. Now, I don't know how many of you have ridden the inner-city bus system, but I never like to go to a bus station. It's the crummiest place in town usually. And so I had to go to the washroom. So it was winter time, so I had my big overcoat on, and I had to set that aside, and I went in there, and this guy followed me in, a guy about this tall. And he was dressed like a dandy. I mean, he was all buttons and bows, and he said to me, "You're a Christian, aren't you?" And I froze up. I absolutely froze up because I'd seen too much TV, and I pictured him as some kind of a pimp, which was probably right. But all my life I've been plagued by the thought, what if he thought here was a person who could give meaning to his life? What if his question was sincere? And I just, got myself cleaned up and got out of there instead of responding to him. Now, that's about what Peter did. And I would have said, if you'd asked me out in the main concourse of the bus station, yes, I believe in Jesus, I'd die for him. But in the washroom, I went down the drain. And all I'm saying is, it's possible for all of us, in the right circumstance. And God help us. One of the songs we sang this morning, I couldn't help noticing that I'll share him with everybody. Oh yeah. How many people did you meet this week that you shared Christ with? Now, I don't want to be judgmental, but as I look back over the week, it may not have been very many, and maybe not even one. And Jesus said, "Whoever's with me is with me, and who stands against me is against me." And so if we don't come out positive on the side of Jesus, we're actually considered an enemy. Think of that. It's a sobering kind of a thought. Well, where do we go? We haven't even got to these questions. Do you think the Jewish leaders were as afraid as Pilate was?
Do you think who?
Do you think the Jewish leaders were as fearful as Pilate was?
No, I think Pilate was a bit more fearful.
Okay.
Because what happened is this: the Jewish leader didn't believe it. They didn't believe who Jesus claimed to be.
Mm-hmm.
Even with all the miracles and everything, they didn't believe. But from the text, we see that Pilate was a bit concerned. He didn't want to hurt him. He didn't want to hurt Jesus. He didn't want to do nothing until until when they start to say that Jesus is a king. And the Jewish people were saying, if he's a king and Caesar hear that, if you look at it carefully, it put Pilate in a predicament, because he could not let Caesar hear that he let go a king. And that is what the text is saying. The Jewish people is saying he's opposing Caesar, or make himself equal to Caesar. And Pilate said, well, I have to kill him. You know, I have to do that, because it could not go back to Caesar that this man claimed to be a king, which is going to be opposing me, the supreme leader, and Pilate let him go. Pilate would have even lost his life if he should have done anything like that. So again, I think just because of who he claimed to be, laid him to be crucified. Let him be crucified.
Karina?
I think they were both afraid, but of different things. Pilate was more afraid of, he didn't want to be crucifying an innocent man, and he was, you know, maybe this person is the Son of God, I don't know. You don't want to be the guy that crucifies the Son of God, even if it's not necessarily part of your religion. But the high priests and the Sanhedrin and them, they were worried that this man was going to upset their entire way of life. I mean, I know they maybe were using it for justification in chapter 11 when we first met Caiaphas, and he was saying, you know, if Caesar hears about this, it's the Jewish nation that's going to suffer. If people start believing in Jesus and following him and all his signs and stuff, and we all follow him, then our entire way of life could be different. All the authority of the high priest disappears if this man really is the Son of God and everyone starts to follow him. What about, then Caiaphas is out of a job, you know? So I think the Jewish leaders were worried about their entire way of life being changed, and Pilate was worried about crucifying an innocent man. And I think they could get more into the mob mentality when they're talking about, oh, Jesus is bad for us, he's bad for the people, he's bad for the Jewish nation, you can really like get the people riled up about that, but it's hard to be like, we gotta crucify this innocent man, you know. It's hard to draw more support for that. So I think Pilate had a more personal reason to be afraid than the high priest who worried about the entire Jewish nation.
Okay. Anybody else want to comment? There's no doubt they were both afraid. It's a matter of opinion who was the most afraid. And of course, Pilate couldn't see into the future and realize that he was doomed anyway. He was shortly out of the job, and I think banished, if I recall correctly. That may not be accurate. But there's no doubt they were all afraid of something. And Pilate's fear may have been more real than theirs, because theirs was built on their projection of what would happen if. You know, we have a terrible propensity in our lives to look at the future in a pessimistic way and say, if this happens, this will happen. And if that happens, this will happen. And we build it up in our minds until the future is such a scary kind of thing. And instead, we need to realize, if you've been reading the devotional book that came out here a couple of weeks ago, it's talking about this very thing of allowing our minds to project a future that is ruinous to us, and encouraging us to turn to Jesus and ask him, what's my future? Well, he doesn't necessarily answer as far as our future on the terra firma, on the earth, but he obviously answers in terms of our real life, the real being. This is just a husk. It's like a corn of grain. It's got a husk on it, but inside is a germ of life. And that's the same thing with us. And they can take away this husk, but they can't take away that germ of life. And not only that, but if they kill us, it's better. It's kind of like Carlos saying, it's a beautiful thing. We can't even get our mind around it, because how can you describe heavenly realities in earthly terms? All you can use earthly equivalents like gold streets and glass gates and that kind of thing. But definitely remember, it's a wonderful thing to die, whether for Christ or otherwise. And we need to be able to keep our minds on that and quit building these fantasies in the air. Call them fantasies, but maybe that's not the word, because we really think that has to do with something good. But keep building the future in a negative way, because we just finished reading the book of Revelation a couple of weeks ago. And have you ever been tempted when you're reading a book to flip to the last page and see how it all works out? Well, we've read the last page and it works out very well. And we need to keep that vision before us as we live and as we serve. Bob?
You said that Pilate couldn't foresee the future, where 2 years later he was gone, but in reality, neither could the Jewish people.
Mm-hmm.
Because in 70 AD, what happened? Their temple was torn down, the Jewish nation was basically destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
So they couldn't see in the future either. They
Right.
could have maybe would have changed their mind.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, 70 AD. That's only about 4 decades after these events. So it wasn't all that long. There were people that experienced this event that were still alive when that happened.
And Jesus warned them about that too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, we get into those chapters, and it's hard to tell when he's talking about the second coming and when he's talking about 70 AD. Yeah, it wasn't the last calamity that was going to happen. Well, as you glance down through those questions, have you got any that you want to comment on?
I find it interesting that the Jewish was complaining that Jesus said that he was king, and that they hadn't. Then they went on, and they were still looking for a Messiah. But the thing is, who did they put their allegiance to? Right here.
Mm-hmm.
They put it to Caesar. They said, Caesar is our king.
Yeah.
Yeah, what a joke.
Talk about being facetious.
Yeah, because on one hand, they were looking to Jesus and hoping he's the one that's going to deliver them from Caesar. Totally misunderstanding his mission, and now claiming, oh, we've only got one king, his name is Caesar. Incidentally, Caesar does not consider himself a god yet at this point in history. That came later. And later